Recently in League of Legends, we've seen a really interesting development where the past couple of world champions have not been dominating after winning their world championship. This is something that we have not seen since the very beginning, first couple of world championships in League. For the most part, we've kind of expected if you're going to have a roster that's been built, that has this kind of success, that's able to go on and win a world championship, you're going to be able to sustain that momentum for a little while. But that hasn't been happening recently. The most recent example is Invictus Gaming, who they still look very strong. They were able to win Worlds and then go on to win the LPL Spring Split, which is a very big accomplishment. That was actually the first Chinese League championship they were able to have. But at MSI, it's typically pretty expected for a world champion to make it to MSI and then go on to either win it or at the very least make the finals and have a very close finals. But Invictus was, they obviously ended up getting beaten in the semifinals by Team Liquid. And it wasn't that close. Team Liquid kind of manhandled them. This wasn't really a circumstance where Invictus just wasn't trying or where they looked like they mentally checked out. They just got outplayed straight up by Team Liquid, who Team Liquid was not looking strong at that point in the tournament. They went 4-6 in groups, I think. And, they are from a historically weak region, and they are historically a team that does not perform internationally. So it was, as much as it was a great accomplishment for Team Liquid, it was also a huge warning sign for Invictus that maybe they're going to be able to fix everything. Maybe they're going to be able to figure out what's going on and clean up their gameplay a little bit so that they can hopefully have a deep run at the upcoming World Championship and maybe win another Chinese season. But that's not something that you that spells danger for China and for Invictus Gaming. Maybe a better example, though, would be the 2017 World Championship that was won by, or was it 2017? Yeah, 2017, that was won by Samsung Galaxy, where firstly, after winning that World Championship, they ended up having tremendous issues with their organization, where firstly, Samsung just disbanded. Samsung decided to stop sponsoring esports teams. Then they joined KSV Gaming or KSV Esports. Then they disbanded, and then they rebranded as Gen G. But on top of that, they have also not been playing well at all. I mean, that was a roster that won a World Championship, and I don't believe they've won an LCK split since. They most recently, in this past spring split, almost got demoted. I mean, they were fighting against getting put in one of the relegation spots, and it was a really dangerous thing for them. It's really interesting that both of these past world champions have had so many issues and so many struggles after winning their world championship, maybe less so for Invictus, but especially for Samsung, when that's not what we're used to. We aren't used to seeing this. That's why it's so interesting. We're used to seeing a world champion that wins worlds and then creates a dynasty of success afterwards. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, specifically talking about SK Telecom. There are some instances where we have seen world champions that have gone on to not win or not repeat at Worlds, but it's typically been because of something like, the players getting bought out. Samsung won the 2014 World Championship with a brilliant roster that was able to crush everybody, but as great as they weren't able to keep their roster together. Every single one of those players got fat contracts to go out and play in China for ridiculous amounts of money because they had so much clout around them that they weren't able to just monetarily keep the roster together. So that's obviously a way that we might see a world champion disappear, but we aren't used to seeing them just disappear into irrelevance for any other reason, for the kinds of reasons that we're seeing recently. And the largest example of that is SK Telecom. Now, there were a couple of jokers in the last video I made when I talked about MSI. I talked about, G2 and gave hearty congratulations to G2 for their incredible performance winning MSI. That the first international tournament that a team has won in the LCS era, a Western team, much less just Europe. But I did mention it's a shame they didn't get to play the best team. That could have been an exciting series. They didn't have to play Invictus Gaming in the finals because Team Liquid had their upset, and that could have been exciting because Invictus Gaming was the best team at that tournament. It's kind of hard to argue that. I also mentioned, though, that it's a shame that SK Telecom is so bad right now because this SKT roster really is put to shame by the previous rosters that SK Telecom has had. And there were a couple of comments. There was one comment in particular I saw where a guy said, "This is the best roster that SKT has ever had." This is the best roster SKT has ever had. That's somebody said that. And I don't know if he actually believes that. I don't know if any of you believe that. But if any of you think that this is the best roster that SK Telecom has ever assembled before, I would like to say, welcome to League of Legends. It's good to see new faces here. It's good to see that even after all these years, there are new people getting involved in the esports scene. But that's not true. And there is a lot of history with SK Telecom and a reason why they're expected to succeed, and a reason why when you see the current SK Telecom roster and all the struggles that they've had where, they were able to win the LCK, but in a really interesting fashion, if you actually watch those games, all those games looked really, it was interesting seeing what happened in LCK this split, but that's not really the level that SKT is held to. This is an SKT. SKT is a team that has an incredibly high bar for accomplishment and achievement because of how historically successful this roster has been. So we're going to take a trip down memory lane today while we're waiting for all the leagues, the LCS, LCK, everything to start, and talk a little bit about how incredible SKT was. Because as we see more and more world champions fall apart, as we see teams that are able to maybe rise to the top and then fall away pretty quickly afterwards, it's really starting to put in perspective how great SK Telecom really was and how incredible that they've been able to have so much success for so many years. So this is going to be a fun video, and I hope you guys enjoy it. But firstly, we obviously have to start by going all the way back to 2013, Season 3, because this is when SKT first won promotion into the OGN Champions. I might call it LCK just for continuity, but they won promotion into the Korean League back in the spring split of 2013. Now in 2012, that was the first year Korea got League of Legends, but they actually didn't have a league for a full year before that World Championship happened. So even though Azubu Frost was kind of the favorites to win Worlds, and even though it was an incredible, exciting upset that Taipei Assassins were able to beat them in the finals, it's still kind of 2013 was the year that everyone was really looking to Korea as the favorites to not only win Worlds, but as the favorites to produce some great rosters. There were these really incredible superstars at the time. There was Flame, who played for CJantis Blaze, I believe, or maybe there was still Azubu Blaze then. There was Mad Life, who played for Azubu Frost, CJantis Frost. There was Mach Noon, who played on Najin, who was this crazy, exciting carry top laner. And there was so much talent in that region. But in winter, SKT was not in the LCK. Back then they still had a winter season. Then SKT won promotion into spring, and then in spring I think they made it to the semifinals in their very first split, which was really interesting and exciting. I should probably mention that back then there were two rosters for SK Telecom. There was SK Telecom T1-1 and SK Telecom T1-2. And the T1-2 roster is the one that had Faker, Bengi, Impact, Piglet, and Pumandu. And it was really exciting to see how great they turned into. The first time they won promotion into the league, they were able to immediately have success making it to the semifinals of an OGN, which is incredible for how stacked Korea was and how hard everybody was trying to become the dominating, successful team in Korea. This was just a bunch of new kids on the block. This was not the legendary Mach Noon or Mad Life or Flame. This was a roster that was filled with all really young players. They were 16 to 18 years old. They were all super young and inexperienced. They were not the veterans of the game that you would expect to see have immediate success. And they ended up going into the summer split. In the summer season of OGN, they ended up obviously winning it. They beat KT Rolster, reverse sweeping them 3-2 in the finals. And it was that was obviously the amazing roster that ended up having Faker's great outplay against Ryu that has forever embarrassed KT Rolster. But it was incredible to see that this new roster, who hadn't even been together playing for longer than a year, we're not only able to go on and win a Korean championship, but the fact that they had so much poise about them. They had incredibly clean gameplay, firstly. They had maybe some of the cleanest gameplay you'll ever see in League's history, where they were so far ahead of everybody else that they played against. But the fact that they were able to, they got in situations that were tough sometimes. They got in situations where they were down 2-0 in the semifinals. They got into situations at the upcoming World Championship where they went into a Game 5 against Najin Black Sword in the semifinals of that year's Worlds. And even though they were this new roster, that was inexperienced, that was young in their playing careers and just young as human beings, they were still teenagers that were, I don't want to call them immature, but they were not like some 30-year-old father who's playing professional sports, but he clearly has a lot of life experience, so he can understand and perform under pressure because he's someone that's lived a long life, right? They were incredibly young, but they had great coaching in Keikoma. They just had an incredible clutch factor so that even if they were down 2-0 to KT, they would reverse sweep them. Even if they went to Game 5, they would never choke, and they obviously ended up going on to win that World Championship, beating RNG 3-0 in the finals. Then, in the next year, 2014, that was a down year for SKT. So that was the year that, firstly, they ended up winning another Korean championship, just no big deal. They ended up going on to win that winter Korean championship, but then in the spring and summer, both of those splits, they would end up falling in the semifinals, I think it was, to the Samsung rosters, where that was the year that Samsung was putting together some amazing rosters, one of which that would go on to win that year's World Championship. And it was an exciting thing to see how, Samsung had their own storyline going on, and SKT was still able to play very well, but they ended up just barely not qualifying for Worlds because of losing to Samsung. And then they also had a kind of, they were on a little bit of a decline and had an uncharacteristic loss to, I think, Najin White Shield that ended up getting them knocked out of the last Korean spot for that year's Worlds. But anyway, then that year was when the roster ended up falling apart. That was partially due to the Korean exodus. After that year's World Championship, we saw every single one of those Samsung players who won that year's World Championship. They all went off to China to make a bunch of money there. And then SKT kind of fell apart. Piglet and I forget if Pumandu left or if he just retired, but Piglet, he went off to NA, I think, and then impacted as well. And the roster kind of fell apart. But then that was also the year, it's kind of important to know because this was very convenient for SKT. That was also the year that Riot outlawed sister teams. So you were no longer allowed to have two teams under the same organization playing in a league. You had to have only one team. And so every team combined their roster to make a big super team. Now, SKT's team was really interesting because while they had Faker, who stayed with SKT obviously that year, and they were building like these great rosters around Faker on SKT T1 2, the other SKT team was a team that was built around a superstar top laner named Marin. And so when SKT was able to combine their rosters, they ended up having Marin in the top lane, Faker in the mid lane. They ended up keeping Bengi for the jungle, and then they had Bang and Wolf in the bot lane. And this was the roster they had going into the 2015 season. And this was maybe the best roster that we have ever seen in the history of League of Legends. Like, this was just incredible what this roster was able to do. I say phrases like that a lot sometimes when I'm making videos, and, I talk about M5 being the most dominating team in League's history, or I talk about Taipei Assassins having the greatest upset in the game's history. But I might use superfluous language like that to try and emphasize how important some things were in the history of League and how this team was able to completely change, rewriting the game's history with what their accomplishments were. But this was literally the greatest roster that we have ever seen put together on paper. And just to list off their accomplishments and talk about how that 2015 season ended up going, they had the superstar Faker in the mid lane. They had the superstar Marin in the top lane. Bang and Wolf ended up being incredible players in their own right. And Bengi has, a former world championship. Former world champion. He was able to have tremendous rapport with the team right away. And while super teams often have growing pains where they struggle to figure out how to play together, while all these superstars might have clashing personalities where they all want to be the superstar, when you get a bunch of superstars together, they all expect to be the center of attention. That was not the case for this team. I mean, you can blame Kei-Koma for just not blame him. You can credit Kei-Koma for having the incredible coaching that he had, but this was really a team that was able to succeed right away. Firstly, they ended up winning the spring preseason. Riot banned OGN from having a winter season at that point, but they still had a preseason in the spring that kind of served as competition during that time slot. SKT would immediately go on to finish first in that preseason. Then in the regular season, they ended up getting second in the regular season, spring season, I believe, but that was second to the GE Tigers. And then SKT would go on to win like 3-0ing the GE Tigers, I think, in the finals, still winning that spring championship. Then in the summer season, they would end up finishing first and winning the summer season regular season, and then sweeping KT Rolster to win in the playoffs. So spring champions, summer champions, headed into Worlds, and that Worlds was the greatest accomplishment that we have seen a single roster have. So SKT would go on to win that 2015 World Championship, but that might not give the sense of how incredible their performance was. So firstly, you should probably note that SKT did not drop a single game until the finals, where they played against the GE Tigers, I think it was, and then they ended up losing a single game against them in the best of 5, but they would 3-1 them and win that World Championship. It's also probably worth noting that they didn't lose a single Tier 2 tower until those finals. They never lost a Tier 2 turret until those finals. Like, that's how good this roster was, how accomplished they were, where they were just able to crush everybody to a point where nobody stood a chance against them. They couldn't get past the second wave of towers, much less take a single game off them in a best of 5. The only team that was able to do it was the Tigers, and they weren't even able to take more than a game off of them. It was incredible how great that roster was and how impressive their performance was to win that World Championship. I mean, and then the thing is, that's a roster that did not fall apart. 2016 was more of the same. They ended up getting second to Rocks in the regular season. GE Tigers turned into Rocks Tigers. They ended up getting second to the Tigers in the regular season, but then they 3-1 to them to win that playoff. So still winning that spring season. They ended up getting second to Rocks again in the summer, and then that time they failed to make the finals as they lost to KT, as KT kind of had their own storyline going on there, which I'm talking about in an upcoming documentary. But up until that point, SKT had won every single LCK finals that they had made. They had won 2 world championships, the previous year's world championship with this amazing roster, and then they would go on to win the second world championship. They would win the 2016 Worlds with their amazing roster, being the first team to repeat as world champions, and they had one of the toughest roads imaginable too. They had to play against RNG, they had to play against the Rocks Tigers, and they had to play against Samsung, and they beat all of them in bracket on their way to winning Worlds. It was incredible. I mean, they are one of the most incredible dynasties that has been able to assemble all of these great rosters and have this continued success for such a long period of time, where even after that 2016 season, then again, I forget if Marin and everybody started leaving for China again, but they ended up having to shuffle their roster a little bit. They ended that next season, they had a bit of an issue where you kind of needed a top laner that was able to play both tanks and carries. And in that 2017 season, they had 2 top laners. They had Huni and Untara. I always call him Intara. They had Untara and Huni, where Untara was mainly like the passive tank guy and Huni was the carry guy top lane. And they weren't able to have that same level of success. That was the year that Longzhu came up and were finally able to beat SKT in a finals to win an LCK championship. And I mean, they still made it to Worlds and made it to the finals, only ending up losing to Samsung again. But like that's what SKT is. You know, when we talk about an SKT roster today, it's important to note who we're comparing them to. You know, they are an organization that has assembled some of the greatest rosters that we have ever seen in the history of League of Legends. If you want to, you can credit that with like Faker. You can say, oh, you know, this is like Faker. He's just the best. And anybody who had Faker is going to be able to make great rosters that turns into world champions. But that's not the case. This is SK Telecom, who has it's really hasn't been all about Faker as great as he's been. They have been able to create all these different game plans and have this incredible coaching and this incredible team atmosphere where they're just so perfect and clean in their gameplay that you watch them, and whether they're super young and inexperienced or veterans of the game, you expect them to be by far and away the overall favorites to win everything they play in. You expect them to win even if they're down 2-0 in a best of 5. They're a team that's really, the coaching in particular is something that almost reminds you of Bill Belichick, if you want to make a comparison to traditional sports, where even if you see a team that is able to do well against the Patriots in the regular season, especially the start of the regular season, even if you're able to see a team that is able to beat them in the first half of the game, they are so great about making adjustments and figuring out what they're doing in the middle of a best of 5, that even if they're getting beat by a strategy, how to neutralize that strategy and then start using their own tactics to end up beating their opponent and still winning 3-2 by the end of it. I mean, they are a team that has been so clean in their gameplay and their coaching that they're hands down the most successful, incredible, and impressive dynasty in the history of League of Legends. And when we talk about SKT's roster today not being that good, that's kind of why we're saying that. If you look at Khan in the top lane, he's been having all these issues. He got solo killed by Rascal when he was playing Jace, his favorite champion, his signature champion. He got solo killed by Rascal top lane in the semifinals of this year's LCK Spring Split. When you look at Teddy and all the mistakes he's been making, he was making those weird teleports against G2 at MSI. And Faker, he's nowhere near as crushingly oppressive as he's been in the past, as previous iterations of Faker has been. SKT is still a great team right now, and they still have a lot of talent, and there's still a great chance that, they still have K-Koma coaching them. They could totally end up winning this year's Worlds. They could totally turn this roster into one of those great rosters that we've seen in previous years. But when you look at their accomplishments so far, when you see that they have had a lot of issues beating Kingzone, a lot of issues beating Griffin, in the LCK finals this year, they kind of almost relied on Griffin losing that finals rather than them doing something great to win it. And then similarly, they would have lost to Kingzone if Kingzone just didn't end up choking in the late game in 2 of their series. There were a lot of moments where SKT could have lost the LCK this year if the opponents they played against just played better. And then all those flaws and issues that they have in their gameplay got exposed at MSI. And that's why we're being critical. That's why if you're someone that's been around with League of Legends for a long time and seen SKT in a while, you're not used to seeing that. You're not used to seeing SKT win games because their opponents end up messing up. You're used to seeing SKT win games because there's no possible way for their opponents to win them, because there's nothing their opponents can do to come close to winning them, even if they go up 2-0 in a series or something. SKT is one of the most dominating and incredible organizations that you have seen in the history of League of Legends if you've been around for a really long time. And it's incredible seeing their accomplishments, especially put in context now, especially now that we know it's not usual for you to see a world champion go on and then just win 3 world championships, or go on and win every single domestic title after they win worlds. That's not what actually happens. That was just SKT being incredible, because they have been an incredible organization. You really cannot give them enough credit for the accomplishments that they've made. And that's why we're harsh on them in LCK and how they've been doing recently. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video. I would highly suggest you watch LCK in this upcoming split. There are a ton of exciting and interesting stories going on there that I will be talking about a little bit, possibly in a couple of upcoming videos. But LCK is going to be really interesting this year because SKT does have flaws right now, and there are just better teams than them in the LCK right now. The remnants of Kingzone almost beat them in a best of 5, and Griffin has continuously topped the standings. Is Griffin going to be able to get over their choking in the playoffs? Is SKT going to be able to clean up their gameplay and bring a world championship back to Korea? I don't know, but it's going to be exciting and fun to watch and see what happens. But anyway, I hope you guys all enjoyed watching this video. I will be back tomorrow with another video talking about League of Legends and its esports scene. But until then, thank you very much for watching. Good luck in solo queue, and have a wonderful day.